What really happened when the Catholic Church engaged modernity in the 19th century? My next guest has explored exactly what happened and how it could affect the future. Here's my exclusive interview with theologian, columnist, and author of the new book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History: How the Church Rediscovered Itself and Challenged the Modern World to Reform. George Weigel. Now, the prologue of this book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, you write that the conventional telling of the story of Catholicism and modernity is wrong. Well, how is it wrong?
It's wrong, Raymond, because it sets up an action-reaction cycle in which it's simply the modern world that acts and the Catholic Church that reacts. And that's just not the way things have been for the past 250 years. A relationship that began with mutual anathemas being hurled in both directions has providentially ended up with the Catholic Church rediscovering the essential truth about itself as an evangelical missionary enterprise. And in the course of that, the Church developed a social doctrine that just might help save this increasingly incoherent postmodern world from imploding.
Yeah, I want to get into all of that. There's one key figure that this story really revolves around, and that's Pope Leo XIII. Now, he was elected Pope in 1878. You point out that he is the Pope that no longer said no to modernity, but instead engaged the modern world with the distinctively Catholic intellectual tools in order to convert the modern world. How did that decision to engage change the Church?
That decision, Raymond, was formed over the 20-some years before Cardinal Pecci, as he was elected Leo XIII in 1878. He had been the Bishop of Perugia for a long time, and during what amounted to a kind of ecclesiastical exile, he really thought through the problem of how the Church could engage modernity in order to convert it. So when he becomes Pope in 1878, he's got a grand strategy in mind. And that is, as you said, to engage the modern world with distinctively Catholic tools, among them the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, read in the original texts, not filtered through hundreds of years of commentators, which Leo thought was particularly apt for helping the Church deal with all of the new questions being raised by modern science, modern philosophy, modern ways of reading ancient texts. He was a truly transformative figure, and here in Rome you can see that embodied in his tomb, where he's standing up, he's portrayed as standing up, on top of the stone casket, with his right hand raised and his right foot thrust forward, as if to say to the modern world, look, we have something to talk about. We have a proposal to make. And that set in motion 80 years of conversation, sometimes argument, sometimes bitter argument in the Church about how to engage modernity in order to convert it.
Now, George, most people would look at Vatican II as the event that really forced the Church to engage the modern world. What role does Vatican II play in your telling of this story, and what is the legacy of Vatican II in your estimation?
Vatican II is a hinge moment in this story, but the story really begins, as we just indicated, in the late 19th century. Vatican II was John XXIII's effort to take all of that energy that had been let loose in the Church by what I call the Leonine Revolution, focus it through the prism of an ecumenical council, and then get about the business of converting modernity. If you read John XXIII's opening address to Vatican II, it's all about making the truth of Christ available and compelling in the late 20th century world. It's about conversion. Now, we all know what happened after the council, 20 years of chaos and confusion.
Right.
Then come the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. The Church is given an authoritative interpretation of the council and comes out of that period with a new understanding of itself, a new grasp of itself, I think would be a better way to put it, as a missionary enterprise devoted to evangelization in the now postmodern world.
George, wouldn't you say, though, that the church has been hurt by embracing modernity? It really hasn't converted it. I mean, none of the concessions made since Vatican II have really helped grow the church. The new evangelization of John Paul II and Benedict that you point out and you highlight in the book, that really hasn't increased the number of Catholics or the number of vocations. In fact, the ordinations have dropped between 65 and 2002. So what's the lesson here? What's missing?
What was missing was a common thread to tie together those 16 Vatican II documents into a coherent tapestry. And that thread was forged by the extraordinary synod that John Paul II summoned in 1985, 20 years after the council, to look at what had gone right and what had gone wrong in those 2 decades. And the common thread is this notion of the church as a communion of disciples in mission. The parts of the world church that have embraced that self-understanding are in fact growing today. There were no focus missionaries 30 years ago. There were no growing religious orders of women 30 years ago. There were no great Catholic campus ministries of the kind we find at, for example, Texas A&M University 30-some years ago. All of these living parts of the world church, which include parishes, dioceses, seminaries like Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland, which has been full for the last several years. These all are the places that have embraced this vision of a church permanently in mission in which everyone is a missionary disciple. The places in the world church that are dying, Germany being example number 1, are the places that keep trying to make the Catholic Light project work. It doesn't. Catholic Light is boring, uninteresting, and evangelically infertile.
I want to read something you write in the book. You say, rather than killing Catholicism, the encounter with modernity has helped the church rediscover some basic truths about itself. Even more ironically, the church's rediscovery of these truths might, just might, put Catholicism in a position to help secular modernity save itself from its own increasing incoherence. Now, George, you're there in Rome. You were covering this Amazon Synod. Are you hearing coherence from the church in Rome these days? Seems just the opposite from where I sit.
Yeah, it's a bit of a problem here in Rome these couple of weeks, Raymond. I think there are a lot of people here who are still trying to make Catholic Light work, who are thinking of the church as a kind of non-governmental organization, not as a communion of disciples in mission. I think we're learning that the church in Latin America, or at least a lot of it, is still stuck in the 1970s. And that's a tragedy because a path forward has been demonstrated. It's been demonstrated in all of the living parts of the world church I just cited. And yet we're still kind of spinning our wheels here. That's too bad.
Yeah. There's a section of the book that frankly, I was riveted to. I finished it last night. And the chapter is called The Franciscan Stall. And you point to 2 controversies that pose serious obstacles to the new evangelization and the church's capacity to reconstruct the foundations of modern public life. And those 2 things are basically Amoris Laetitia, and it's granting the sacrament of communion to men and women who have not gotten an annulment and have remarried, and what you call the Gallican concept of the church. Explain to people why those 2 obstacles are such high bars to the church engaging the modern world today.
I think, Raymond, beneath the confusions surrounding the implementation of Amoris Laetitia is a deeper question. And that is, does revelation, does God's word, for example, the word of the Lord on the nature of marriage, the word of St. Paul on worthiness to receive Holy Communion, does revelation judge history, or does history judge revelation? The forces at the synods of 2014 and 2015, which were pressing hard for a change in the church's sacramental discipline, are those who believe that history judges revelation, that sometimes we actually know better. than the Lord or St. Paul about how to make the gospel work. That's been a very bad set of ideas in the Christian world for about the last 250 years. It has manifestly hollowed out what used to be the large, vibrant churches of liberal Protestantism, and we should not want to imitate that in the Catholic Church. The Gallican problem is the notion that the Catholic Church is not a universal church with distinctive local expressions. It's a federation of national churches. This doesn't work either. Look at the Anglican Communion, which is rather badly incoherent today, because what goes in Uganda or Nigeria doesn't go in Yorkshire or London. This is not a formula for saying to an increasingly skeptical but also increasingly desperately needy postmodern world, look, we think we have been given the truth of our humanity in Jesus Christ, and we'd like to offer that to you. We can't say that if we don't know what that means and what boundaries it sets on our human activity.
But George, there seems to be a division implied today, and look, it's coming out of Germany, it's coming out of Rome these days, that there's a conflict between doctrine and belief and love of Jesus Christ, that they're somehow at odds. And that division, it seems to me, is a canard. And in fact, it drives people further away from that love of Jesus Christ, if that indeed is the goal.
Yeah, that's really a bad idea, Raymond. The notion that truth and mercy are somehow in a profound tension, even in opposition, is just wrong. The most merciful thing we can do for anyone is to help him or her understand the truth of their situation, what makes for real happiness, beatitude, human flourishing, and then accompany them. I'm all for accompaniment. Accompany them as they grow into that truth. But the notion that you can set truth and mercy against each other is really pernicious, and it needs to be countered with the Lord's own words. The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free, and it will set you free in the deepest meaning of human liberation. None of us live that truth perfectly. We all need to admit that. But in admitting that, we shouldn't try to dumb down the truth.
George, I want to get to Commonweal took some shots at your book in a long review/critique. I want to read a little bit of this review and just get your reaction. They say, in general, Weigel believes that our present moment, which he calls postmodernity, is defined by the curse of rampant individualism, which is both intellectual and moral components. Intellectually, he believes we have, in our universities especially, abandoned a commitment to rationality and truth. And they go on and say, Weigel's not interested in the many ways that secular and religious people today craft morally meaningful lives for themselves. He's not interested in the role that the universities can play in that process. A minor yet persistent theme in the book is the claim that universities are purveyors of relativism and no longer teach people to apprehend the truth. They also suggest you write this in bad faith. Your reaction?
Well, that was a hit piece. It was published 4 weeks before the book was available. So it was manifestly a review, quote unquote, intended to kill the baby in the cradle. This is really bad behavior, it seems to me. It is dishonest. It's certainly unfair. And it's a gross misrepresentation of the book. Now, I think my description of what's going on most elite university campuses today, including the campus where the gentleman in question, the reviewer, teaches, is entirely accurate. No one is going to make, no serious person is going to make the argument that elite universities today are bastions of free speech. On the contrary, they're bastions of political correctness. And if it's not understood by our friends at Commonweal how this rampant and rancid individualism is eroding our political culture, is making for many, many unhappy lives, and increasingly disturbing suicide rate, especially among young people, then it's not me that's out of touch. It's the editors at Commonweal.
You write in here, and I'll leave you with this, you take on the sex abuse crisis as well, and the stumbling block that presents to the Church as it seeks to engage the modern world. In what way can the Church get past this really loss of moral voice and moral authority in the wake of the sex abuse crisis, so it can provide the answers that you claim it has for every human life?
Raymond, the first thing I think all of us within the Church need to do is live this as a moment of necessary purification. The purification is going to be painful, but it's absolutely essential, because unless we are seen to live what we propose, what we propose makes for genuine human flourishing, happiness, beatitude, fulfilled lives, unless we're seen to live that, nobody's going to listen to us. So we are in an essential moment of purifying ourselves for the work of evangelization and for the work of cultural reformation. Our culture is crumbling around us. And if we are going to be able to say, no, look, we have, we think, a better idea of what makes the human person happy, what makes for good marriages, stable families, loving relationships, compassion for the poor and the marginalized. We're not going to be able to make that proposal unless we're seen to live it in the life of the Church itself, and that's going to mean some painful purification.
George Weigel, thank you for being here. The book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, is available everywhere, bookstores, online. Go get a copy. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Raymond.